Keanu Reeves stepped into the lavish Lumiere restaurant, his attire a stark contrast to the elegance surrounding him. Dressed in simple, slightly wrinkled clothes, he looked as if he had just come from an ordinary day. He moved with quiet confidence, selecting a discreet table in an attempt to remain unnoticed, even as the dazzling glow of crystal chandeliers bathed the room in golden light. But before he could even place his order, a waitress approached with a look of disdain and an arrogant stance. "Are you sure you can afford to be here?" she snapped, her tone laced with sarcasm, loud enough for nearby patrons to hear. What happened next would not only leave everyone in the restaurant stunned, but also reveal a truth that changed everything. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, be sure to subscribe to Heroic Stories USA. We bring you captivating stories every day, and tomorrow we have another special tale just for you. Through the gilded entrance, a man stepped inside, his presence barely registering among the extravagantly dressed patrons. Unlike the others, he wore no tailored suit, no polished leather shoes. Instead, he donned a well-worn pair of jeans, a simple cotton shirt, and an unbranded jacket that, while comfortable, showed signs of frequent wear. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and his boots bore the scuffs of time. Despite his unassuming attire, there was something about him, a quiet confidence that made him stand out more than any designer label ever could. He moved with ease, unaffected by the brief glances and raised eyebrows that flickered in his direction. Approaching the reception desk, he smiled politely. "Good evening," he greeted, his voice smooth yet unassuming. "I'd like a table, please." Behind the desk stood Samantha, a seasoned hostess with an eye for detail and a talent for assessing clientele in an instant. She prided herself on maintaining the exclusivity of Lumiere, ensuring that only the right kind of guests were granted the privilege of dining there. As she lifted her gaze from her tablet, her well-rehearsed hospitality faltered for a fraction of a second. She took in the man's attire, the casual ease with which he stood there, and her lips curled slightly before she quickly masked it, with her professional, albeit distant smile. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" she asked, her voice carrying a tone of thinly veiled condescension, as if she were doing him a favor by asking. The man, Keanu Reeves, met her gaze without hesitation. His expression remained calm, a small, knowing smile forming on his lips. "Yes," he replied, his tone steady and unwavering. "I believe this is the place." Samantha exhaled theatrically, her fingers tapping against the screen as she pretended to check for his name in the reservation system. "I don't see a reservation under your name," she finally said, feigning mild surprise. "We do have a few tables available, but just so you're aware, Lumiere isn't exactly a casual dining spot." Keanu didn't flinch. "That's fine. I'd still like to dine here." As Keanu calmly browsed the menu, the soft hum of conversation and the clinking of silverware filled the air. The restaurant exuded an aura of sophistication, but there was an unmistakable tension lingering at his table. It wasn't the setting that made it uncomfortable. It was the piercing, judgmental gaze of Samantha as she approached, notepad in hand, her posture rigid with condescension. "Have you decided what you'd like, or would you like a recommendation?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm, as if she was indulging a child playing dress-up in an upscale restaurant. Keanu glanced up at her, his expression calm and unreadable. Without hesitation, he pointed at one of the restaurant's signature dishes. "I'd like the filet de Rossini, please." Samantha raised an eyebrow, barely suppressing an incredulous chuckle. "Just to confirm, sir, you do realize this dish costs $350. Her tone was equal parts mockery and disbelief, her smirk a silent dare for him to admit his mistake and order something more appropriate. Keanu simply nodded, his demeanor unwavering. "Yes, it sounds wonderful." For a brief moment, Samantha stared at him, almost as if expecting him to change his mind, to stammer out an apology and settle for something simpler, something more within his means. When that didn't happen, she tilted her head and let out a sharp exhale. "All right then," she said with exaggerated patience, "just making sure you won't be surprised later." She jotted down the order with an unnecessary flourish, then turned sharply on her heel and strode toward the kitchen. As she passed by a fellow waiter, Mark, she leaned in just enough for him to hear. "He's definitely going to ask for tap water," she murmured with a smirk. Mark, a seasoned professional who had seen every kind of customer walk through Lumiere's doors, frowned slightly. Maybe he just wants to have dinner, Samantha. Samantha scoffed. Not in those boots. She shook her head as if she had already determined how the night would play out. Across the dining room, a well-dressed elderly gentleman, Mr. Harrison, had been observing the exchange with quiet disapproval. He had dined at Lumiere for years, and he had seen the way some of the staff treated those they deemed unworthy. Taking a slow sip of his wine, he raised his glass slightly in Keanu's direction. A silent acknowledgement, a subtle act of solidarity. Keanu, noticing the gesture, responded with a gentle nod and a small, knowing smile. He wasn't bothered by Samantha's attitude. He had seen this kind of behavior before. But what she didn't know, what no one in that restaurant yet understood, was that appearances could be deceiving. And tonight she was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Keanu sat in his dimly lit corner, the ambient hum of conversation and the occasional clinking of glasses filling the air around him. Despite being seated in one of the least desirable spots in the restaurant, he seemed entirely at ease, his expression calm, his posture relaxed. The golden glow of the chandeliers didn't quite reach his table, but if he noticed the slight chill of the draft from the nearby kitchen entrance, he gave no indication. Meanwhile, Samantha made a point of avoiding his order. Instead of heading to the kitchen immediately, she lingered at the tables of well-dressed guests, effortlessly engaging in small talk, laughing a little too loudly at their jokes, ensuring her presence was noted by those she deemed worthy of her attention. Every few minutes she would steal a glance toward Keanu's table, half expecting him to wave her down, to grow impatient, to signal that he was ready to leave. But he didn't. He simply sat there, calmly observing the room as if time itself had no hold on him. As the minutes ticked by, the deliberate neglect did not go unnoticed. Across the room, Mr. Harrison, the distinguished elderly gentleman who had observed the previous interaction, took another sip of his wine, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. He had dined at Lumiere, long enough to recognize the kind of quiet discrimination taking place, and he didn't like it. Pushing back his chair, he made his way toward Keanu's table, his polished shoes tapping lightly against the marble floor. As he reached the table, he gave a polite nod. "Good evening, young man. I couldn't help but notice that you've been waiting quite some time." Keanu looked up, his serene smile unwavering. "It's all right. I have nowhere to be." Harrison let out a low chuckle, his deep voice rich with amusement. "Patience is a virtue not many have. I admire yours." Keanu gave a small nod of appreciation. "Sometimes things take as long as they need to. No point in rushing what's out of my control." Before the conversation could continue, Samantha finally made her way over, a carefully crafted smile plastered on her face. "Sir, can I help you with something?" she asked, her voice smoother now, her tone lacking the sharp edge it had carried earlier. Mr. Harrison turned to face her, his expression shifting ever so slightly, his voice taking on a firmness that hadn't been there a moment ago. "Just offering some company to a fellow diner. Something this place seems to be lacking tonight." Samantha's lips pressed together, her fingers tightening slightly around the notepad in her hand. She hesitated for a moment, as if considering whether to push back, but the weight of Harrison's gaze made her think twice. Without another word, she turned on her heels and walked away, her posture a little stiffer than before. Harrison turned back to Keanu, his expression unreadable for a moment before his lips curled into a slight smirk. "I have a feeling tonight is going to be interesting." Keanu simply smiled, a quiet understanding passing between the two men. When Samantha finally emerged from the kitchen, Keanu's meal in hand, she made no effort to conceal her irritation. With an unnecessary amount of force, she set the plate down in front of him, the sound of ceramic meeting wood echoing slightly. "Here's your order," she said curtly, her lips barely curving into what could pass as a smile. "Enjoy. And don't forget, the minimum tip is 20%. Keanu glanced at her, his expression unreadable, then nodded politely. "I'll keep that in mind. Thank you." Samantha lingered for a second, expecting some kind of reaction, a look of discomfort, a reluctant acknowledgement, maybe even an awkward attempt to leave. But Keanu remained composed, taking a measured sip of water before picking up his utensils, completely unaffected. Annoyed that her efforts to unsettle him had failed, Samantha turned on her heel and strode away, missing the way several nearby patrons were now watching her with clear disapproval. As the evening continued, the quiet murmurs in the dining room grew louder. Conversations that once revolved around business deals and extravagant vacations had shifted to hushed discussions about the unfolding situation. Several guests had noticed the way Samantha had been treating Keanu throughout the night, and their expressions ranged from mild distaste to outright anger. At one table, the couple who had been observing since the beginning exchanged a glance. The woman, elegantly dressed in a sapphire blue gown, had finally had enough. She set her wine glass down with purpose and waved over a passing waiter. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying an edge of authority. "That waitress has been treating that man horribly all night. It's unacceptable. I suggest you get the manager." The waiter hesitated for a split second before nodding. "Right away, ma'am." A moment later, the restaurant manager, Mr. Graham, entered the dining area. A man who prided himself on maintaining the exclusivity and reputation of Lumiere, he walked with an air of authority. However, as his eyes scanned the room and landed on Keanu, he visibly tensed. Recognition dawned on him in an instant, and his confident stride faltered. Without hesitation, he moved swiftly across the restaurant, brushing past Samantha, who had just returned to the floor. "Mr. Reeves," he exclaimed, his voice a mix of surprise and urgency. "I had no idea you were visiting tonight. Please, accept my deepest apologies for any inconvenience." Samantha, who had been adjusting the place settings at a nearby table, suddenly froze. Her face lost all color as she turned sharply, eyes wide with shock. "Mr. Reeves," she stammered, barely able to process what she had just heard. Keanu, still seated, met her gaze with that same calm, composed expression he had maintained all night. There was no anger, no smugness, just quiet authority. He set his napkin down on the table, then looked back at Mr. Graham. "Yes," he confirmed simply, his voice steady. Then, after a brief pause, he added, "And I think we need to talk about how we treat people." The entire restaurant fell into a hushed silence, an air of tension thickening as every diner turned their attention toward the unfolding scene. The clinking of silverware, the murmurs of conversation, everything had ceased. Mr. Graham's gaze darkened as he turned toward Samantha, his voice sharp but controlled. "Explain yourself." Samantha, who had just moments ago carried herself with an air of smug superiority, now looked pale, her hands gripping the notepad at her side as though it could anchor her in place. She swallowed hard, her voice unsteady. I didn't know who he was. I thought..." "You thought what?" Graham's voice cut through the air, his frustration barely restrained. That a man in simple clothing didn't deserve the same courtesy as someone dripping in designer labels? That he wasn't worth the basic respect we extend to every guest who walks through those doors? Samantha's lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. She had spent years perfecting the art of judging people, in an instant, deciding their worth based on their appearance. And now, that very instinct had led to her downfall. Her breath hitched, and for the first time true remorse flickered in her eyes. Keanu, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. His voice was calm, steady, yet carried a quiet authority that resonated through the room. "Respect shouldn't be reserved for those who look the part. It should be given to everyone, regardless of what they wear, where they come from, or how much money they appear to have. True kindness is how we treat people when we think no one is watching." A murmur spread through the restaurant, several patrons nodding in agreement. Even those who had initially ignored the scene now seemed to feel the weight of Keanu's words. Mr. Harrison, the elderly gentleman who had observed the night's events, lifted his glass slightly once again in silent approval. Samantha's eyes welled up with tears, the enormity of her mistake crashing down on her like a wave. I was wrong," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I judged you unfairly. I let my arrogance blind me to what really matters." Keanu nodded, his expression neither condemning nor triumphant. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after." Samantha inhaled shakily, nodding as she wiped at the tears forming in her eyes. "I want to do better." Mr. Graham's expression softened ever so slightly, though his voice remained firm. "Then start by remembering that every guest here is worthy of the same level of service and respect, no exceptions." As the tension in the room began to dissolve, Keanu picked up his napkin, folded it neatly, and set it back on the table. The lesson had been delivered, and now it was up to everyone present to decide what they would take from it. That night, after the last table had been cleared and the restaurant had closed its doors to the public, the staff gathered in the dimly lit dining room. There was no clatter of plates, no soft murmurs of conversation, just the quiet weight of reflection hanging in the air. Keanu stood before them, his expression thoughtful, yet firm. "What we saw tonight," he began, his voice steady but carrying the gravity of the lesson learned, was more than just poor service. It was a reflection of how we sometimes judge too quickly, how we let appearances dictate the way we treat others. He let his words settle for a moment, his gaze sweeping across the group. Some of them looked down, embarrassed. Others met his eyes, fully absorbing the weight of the evening's events. The truth is, Keanu continued, we don't know people's stories. The person who seems out of place might have had a harder journey than we can imagine. The smallest kindness, the simplest act of respect, can make a difference. Sometimes it's the difference between someone feeling invisible and feeling seen. Samantha, who had remained quiet until now, stepped forward. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and there was no trace of the arrogance she had carried earlier in the night. I'm truly sorry, she said, her voice raw with emotion. I was wrong, and I see that now. I promise I'll change. Keanu studied her for a moment before offering her a small, knowing smile. That promise is to yourself, not to me, he said gently. Growth isn't about saying the right things in the moment. It's about choosing to be better, every single day. Samantha nodded, determination flickering in her expression. Others in the group shifted, the weight of his words stirring something deeper in them. With a final glance around the room, Keanu exhaled, as if releasing the tension of the evening into the air. This place, this industry, it isn't just about serving food, it's about serving people. And people, all people, deserve to be treated with dignity. He turned toward the exit, the sound of his footsteps light against the polished floor. As he reached the door, he paused, looking back one last time. In a world where you can be anything, he said, his voice calm yet powerful, choose to be kind. With that, he stepped out into the night, the city lights casting a warm glow against the pavement. The air was crisp, and as he walked away, the weight of the evening didn't feel heavy. It felt purposeful. Tonight had been about more than just a meal. It had been about changing perspectives, about opening hearts. And as the doors of Lumiere closed behind him, something else opened. A possibility, a shift, a quiet, lasting change in the way people saw one another.